Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to start by thanking you for joining us today. I'm Steve Zoberg, COO at Forthright, and some of you may have joined us before, so you probably heard this. It's pretty quick. For those of you who haven't worked with Forthright before, and this is your first time, I wanted to give you a really quick 5-minute intro into kind of what we're about. Forthright's been helping clients optimize their application delivery literally for decades, and for us, it's more about how do we supercharge the end user experience versus just the tools and technologies on their own. So we actually built our entire practice around being very user-centric in everything we do. Now, what that means is that passion and the focus is not centered around what tools and products and processes might be optimal for us or even for another IT shop per se, but rather we put ourselves in your shoes and understand and pay very close attention to the experience and the outcomes that are going to impact your end user population and the overall business. So over the years, we've recognized that clients typically fall into one of 3 different categories. Some are looking for consulting services around strategic initiatives and prototyping new technologies. Others need some additional resources for day-to-day operations or new projects. And then, of course, the third group, they want to address their operational costs. They want to be able to focus on their core business. And so what they'll do is they'll work with Forthright to take over full responsibility of very specific technology sets. Now, regardless of where you might fall, there's 6 core service offerings that address these basic needs. And our customers, some will leverage one, some 2. Actually, we have some that will leverage all of them, kind of depends on where you fit. And if any of you are interested in finding out more about any of these services, we would love to talk to you about them in more detail. So reach out to us. You can call our office. You can send us an email at success@forthright.com, and we would be very happy to follow up with you. So today's spotlight conversation is focused around something that end users never really think about, and yet they completely rely on it, and that is data protection and recovery. So ensuring that your data is protected from a whole range of threats that we face today and different compliance challenges, it really can make the difference between an event that occurs that leads to a major outage or work stoppage or a quick and uneventful recovery. So our panelists today, well, they're going to go in and they're going to discuss how to leverage Exagrid to mitigate these kind of risks. And as an example, and I'm sure you get this a lot, and we certainly hear it a lot, is how do I protect my data from ransomware? This is one of many different types of risks that you might face. So today we're going to learn about how Exagrid leverages several unique and very innovative features to address these myriad of risks that we have to deal with. And I will tell you that I think one of my favorites is probably their tiered air gap for storage. And this technology and this concept definitely ensures that you can always recover your data, always. So with that being said, I don't want to take any steam out of the presentation. I am really pleased to introduce Exagrid to all of you. And Abhi, how about you kick off the conversation for us?
All right, perfect. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. So what I'd like to do is really just give you a quick introduction on Exagrid and what we provide. One of the things that I'd like to let you know is that we're a 17-year-old company. We've been shipping product for about 15 years, and we've never end-of-lifed a product in the 15 years of our existence. And that's something that a lot of vendors can't say, right? We basically built a technology that is highly differentiated, in the industry right now, and that differentiation really allowed us to build a product that we could future-proof, right? And when you look at who we actually compete with, we compete with either straight disk, backups to straight disk, or we compete with backups to dedupe appliances. But we are not a dedupe appliance. We're basically a tiered storage system that has an air gap, just like was mentioned earlier. We basically have a tier system that has a landing zone. That landing zone basically is the medium between us and the backup application. And it also is the only part of our system that sits on the network, right? So the backup applications deal directly with the landing zone, right? Then we have a tiered air gap, which allows us now to actually separate my landing zone from my repository. My repository is where my long-term retention and my historical data gets stored. Because of this air gap now, what I can do is I can lock objects into that repository and make them immutable. So this allows us to actually bring on another feature for our ransomware called a retention time lock, which I'll talk about also, which allows us to lock those objects in there. And in the event that there were a disaster or a ransomware attack, it can only affect the landing zone. I still have that repository that sits, behind the landing zone that allows us to actually recover from those objects. When you look at the difference between us and dedupe appliances, again, the biggest difference is the landing zone, right? If you look at dedupe appliances in themselves, they basically only have that repository space that we talked about. So they have to ingest their data and manipulate their data while it's in flight. So I've got to look at a block size, do a hash compare of that block, bucket those compares and say, yes, I've seen that data before, or not seen that data before. I have to upgrade my hash table, I have to compress my data, and then I finally put it onto disk. The problem with inline deduplication is that all I'm storing on that box is that dedupe compressed data. So that very first backup, which is my reference point, and then every delta change afterwards sits on top of that reference point sequentially. So if I have to do a restore, what ends up happening? I have to go find the oldest data on the box, and then I have to pin all the delta changes back together again. So this really takes away from the backup applications, advanced recovery techniques like VM recovery, instant VM restore, Commvault's ability to do that. It takes away from it because I have to actually restore the data first or hydrate the data first before I can provide a restore point that the backup application can do anything with. So what we did is we basically said, let's take that deduplication out of the backup window, dump it to that landing zone, that performance tier, and once it lands there, it's immediately available for restore, right? So 92% of the time when you do a restore, where do you do it from? You do it from your last full backup, right? So we'll always have that last full backup in the landing zone waiting until the next full backup. So you'll have your full backup and your daily incrementals, and then when you do that full backup again, then it updates with that brand new data. So again, having that data in the landing zone really allows us to take advantage of Veeam's instant VM recovery, instant VM restore, or Commvault, or net backup, or even SQL and Oracle RMAN, right? I could do my table space lookups, my rollbacks, my redos right out of that landing zone. So when you couple that with the actual repository, now again, I have that tiered gap right between my data to where if something were to happen, it only affects the landing zone. If ransomware were to go delete, on a dedupe appliance on our competition, they would delete all the data, right? Because they don't have an air gap. Their air gap would be to, back up to one box, replicate it to a second box, and then copy it to a third box and take it offline. We have that built into one single box, right? And that's really what separates us from the other vendors that are out there right now.
Abhi, I have
Yes,
a question. What happens if you have a human error situation where an administrator goes in and actually initiates a deletion and it's unintentional?
Well, that's a great question. So because of the retention time lock, it basically does a delayed delete. So it'll say, oh, I'm getting a request for a delete, but I'm not going to delete it for X amount of time, depending on how much I set that retention time lock for. Right. So it allows me to, even if I have a user error where they go through and do a delete on the landing zone, I can always go back into the repository for however long it's set for, and then go back in there and recover from it. So when it comes to growth, again, we went with that hyper-converged type of approach to backups, right? Traditionally, dedupe appliances or backup appliances basically have that single front-end controller that has a limited amount of processing power, memory, and throughput along with storage capacity, right? So the only way I grow this is I add more disk trays, and unfortunately, you add more disk trays until you grow to the capacity of that model number. And then once you get to like 80% of that model number, your backups start to get slower and slower and slower because they can't keep up. The disk can't keep up with the finite amount of resources in the front end controller. So what ends up happening is that you get to a certain point, then you have to forklift upgrade that control unit and start that process all over again. So you're in that endless cycle of buying a model number, growing it to its maximum potential, it breaking, and then you have to go buy the next bigger model number and start that process all over again. With us, the way we got to the point where we didn't have to end of life a product is we basically built these modules, right, that have enough processing power, memory, and throughput up to a certain storage capacity, and that was enough resources to be able to meet a 4 to 6 hour backup window, right? So our very first box was a 3 terabyte box. Right, as drives got bigger, we came out with a 5 terabyte box, then a 7 terabyte box, then a 10 terabyte box. So the beauty of this is that we didn't have to end of life any of the other boxes, because these could be Lego pieces, right, that go into the same grid, and I could have up to 32 of these devices in a single grid. If I use my largest box out there right now that we have, an 84 terabyte box, I can have 32 of those devices out there, and I can scale up to 2.7 petabytes of landing zone. Also 2.7 petabytes of repository, and a combined throughput of 488 terabytes an hour of throughput. There's nobody out there that can match that speed again. So this is, again, by doing hyper-converge, right, we basically brought high performance computing to the backup space. So as I add more nodes into the grid, I'm adding more landing zone and more repository. These are the actual model numbers that we have, right? Again, we've not end of life any of these products in the 15 years of our existence. And we also have an encrypted model, right? So from the EX10 up, we actually use self-encrypting drives. So the self-encrypting drives are actually 256-bit AES encryption. They're FIPS 140-2 compliant. And again, they do the encryption on the drive itself. So it's encryption at rest. So once it landed in the landing zone, then that data is encrypted. So that basically removes, the need for a key management system, key management software, or key management person, right? It's all done right on the actual drive itself. When we do replication, we actually do our replication using WAN encryption also. So if I replicate from one box to another, or from one box to the cloud, I'll be able to use, we use WAN encryption also. As far as the hardware that's inside of the box, it's all redundant. It's all N+1. We use RAID 6 with 2 parity drives and 1 hot spare in each node. So we have redundant power supplies, redundant NICs, redundant everything, redundant fans. And again, part of our maintenance, we actually guarantee 24-hour part replacement for anything that goes wrong. When it comes to replication, we do replication to, in a couple separate manners. We could go to another box that's in your corporate, data center, or even within your environment. Like say you had another building that we could replicate to. We can actually replicate to a colo facility, or we actually have a client that's an EC2 instance that can sit at AWS right now, and it looks like an Exagrid, and you can put object storage behind it. So I can have, S3 or S31A storage behind that client, and now I can replicate to the cloud. So we have a lot of customers that'll replicate to a secondary site, just to have a DR on-site type of facility, and then they'll also replicate to the cloud to be able to do their long-term retention, like their yearlies, because we do have some financial and medical customers that have to keep data for 7 years or up to 30 years. And the only way to do that effectively is by using the cloud for long-term retention. So if we look at the way we work from a hierarchical approach, again, when we size our customers, we usually size them for what a full backup is, right? So when we talk to you, when we do our call with you, we'll ask you, so what's a full backup and how long do you keep your data for, right? So in this instance, we have a customer that had a 10 terabyte backup, and they were keeping their data for 9 weeks, right? So what we did is we sized them for an EX10. An EX10 basically allowed me to land that 10 terabytes of data landing zone, and once it landed there, it's immediately available for restore, right? Once that backup starts to happen, we adaptively start doing deduplication, and what we'll do is we'll create a reference point that'll be a compressed copy of that full backup in the repository now. Again, remember, the landing zone and the repository are air gap from each other. The repository is just where we keep the historical data, right? The landing zone is what interfaces with the backup application. So if I were to do replication, I can actually take a smaller box, make it all repository, seed that 5 terabyte reference point over there, and then now on the next backup, it'll update the landing zone, it'll update the reference point, it'll store the delta changes between the two, and then it'll only replicate the delta change across the wire, updating that reference point. So I get that very thin replication going from my primary site to my secondary site, and my cost to DR is going to be a lot less than a lot of the other vendors because I don't have to have like-for-like sizes. I can actually have a half-size box that's all repository where I'm just keeping that dedupe compressed data, right? So if I were to do this 9 times, we know that between full backups, it's typically a 2% change rate from backup to backup, full backup to full backup. 2% of 10 terabytes is only 200 gigabytes in size. That's all we're storing on each subsequent backup afterwards, right? So for a 90 terabyte backup, and that's that 10 terabytes for 9 weeks, we're basically putting that data into a 6.6 terabyte footprint in my repository. This is the magic of Exagrid, right? We're only replicating 6.6 terabytes to a secondary site instead of the full 90 terabytes. And if I'm going to the cloud, I'm only replicating 6.6 terabytes to the cloud. Therefore, drastically reducing the amount of storage I need either at the cloud or at my secondary site, right? So it just makes it a lot more less expensive to be able to do replication with us. Okay, when it comes to the backup applications out there, we support all major backup apps. The only ones that we don't support are the ones that are all inclusive, right? That have everything into themselves. But you can see all the major players out there like Veritas, Veeam, Commvault. We do support Oracle RMAN directly to us, and we do support SQL directly to us. So we do have the ability to do databases directly to us. There are certain advantages to some of these backup applications like Veeam. Veeam and us, we basically have done some integration at the kernel level so that we can actually dedupe Veeam's dedupe, right? And we've also done that with Commvault. So Commvault can actually do their data reduction to us, to our landing zone, and then we're able to further dedupe that deduplication for Commvault. So again, depends on which backup application you have. Depends on some of the benefits that we can do. But the whole idea of the landing zone is to be able to take advantage of any of the advanced recovery techniques from these backup applications. Okay, so again, the last part of this is really the ransomware piece. So because of the tiered air gap that we have between the landing zone and the repository, now what we're able to do is we're able to turn our ransomware feature on. And oh, by the way, when it comes to all the feature functionality of the Exagrid, nothing is something, it's not anything that you have to pay for, right? Once you buy an Exagrid, you basically pay for maintenance and all our feature functionality is included in that maintenance, right? So ransomware is a piece of that feature functionality. And basically what ransomware allows me to do is it allows me to take my objects that are in the repository and lock them in there for a set amount of time. And what that means is, like we mentioned before, it's basically a delayed delete, right? And all this does is it says, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be able to set a time for this this time lock in the repository, and I'm going to make those objects immutable, right? And all I'm going to do is consume, 2.5% of that repository space more, right, to be able to do that for each week that I do the retention time lock. So if I wanted to do 30 days of retention time lock, right, then I would only consume 10% more of the repository space instead of having to buy a secondary box or tertiary box and take that offline, right? So a lot of customers see this and they're like, wow, I can actually do hardware ransomware protection without the included cost of having to have multiple boxes, right? We also do this delayed deletion to where I have to have an admin password and a security officer password for two-factor authentication, right? So somebody can't just go out there and delete this, right? And what this does, it does make these objects immutable in there for that set amount of time, right? So again, what this really does, it allows me to not to have a separate system to manage, right? All I do is go in there and I turn retention time lock for the set amount of time that I want, right? There's no extra work required, no configuration or anything that needed. All my backups, my deduplication, my replication, everything stays the same. There's no change to my RPO or RTO. I simply just go in there and say, how long do I want to keep it for up to 30 days. And what it does, it just makes it to where I have enough time to recover from a disaster if a disaster were to happen, whether it be a man-made disaster or an actual ransomware attack. And we know that when it comes to ransomware with backups, there's only 3 types of attacks that can happen. They can delete your backups, they can encrypt your backups, or you can back up encrypted data, right? So if there were an attack, your data would be gone, it'd be encrypted, right? Or you're backing up bad data. You know where that ransomware attack is going to happen or what happened, right? So the first thing you do if you're attacked with ransomware is you actually go in there and you invoke the recovery mode. Basically, this stops the clock, right? So all deletes and everything indefinitely stop, right? Then you call your support engineer. One of the beauties of being an Exagrid customer is that when you become a customer, we assign you a tier 2 support engineer that knows your backup application. So he's a tier 2 support engineer on your backup app. So if you have Net Backup, if you have Veeam, if you have Commvault, He's an expert on that backup app. So he'll help you do the installation. He'll help integrate with the backup application and set up your backup jobs. And then he supports you going forward, intimately knowing your environment. So you get to call Fred and say, look, I've got a problem, Fred. Can you help me? We got hit with ransomware. So what he'll do is he'll actually go and say, okay, let's go find out when the ransomware attack happened, right? Let's find out what a good backup was after deduplication in the repository, and then let's recover from that, right? So an easy example of this happening is, let's say I have my backup number one. It goes through the dedupe process and it gets stored in the repository. Again, I have my retention time lock set for, let's say, 10 days. Well, let's just say 30 days, the max. Let's say I have another backup and it goes through the full dedupe process, right? Now these objects are locked into the repository, and let's say there was a ransomware attack that happened and it actually deletes the landing zone. Again, remember, the landing zone is the only part of our box that sits on the network. So it's the only thing that could be affected. Because of that tiered air gap, I still have those objects in the repository to where I could go find out, hey, where was the last good backup after deduplication, and then I could recover from those objects. If it was at a secondary site, I could recover from the objects at the secondary site. If I was replicating to the cloud, I can recover from those objects that are in the cloud. So really, this gives me that extra level of protection against ransomware. Let's say that I have a good backup, and it goes through the deduplication process. I have another good backup, and let's say I back up encrypted data, or my data gets encrypted. Well, even if it's encrypted and I go through the dedupe process, that delta change isn't going to affect my former backups, right? So because those are immutable, I'm able to go into those objects that are out there that are available, my last good backup after deduplication, and then I'm able to recover from those backups from there. And again, I could do it from there, I could do it from my secondary site, or I could do it from AWS. And I think this is a really exciting feature that we came up with. And because of the tiered air gap that we have, that's what made it all possible, having the landing zone and the repository. So if you got nothing out of this presentation, really the biggest difference between us and everybody else is the landing zone. So it's landing zone, landing zone, landing zone, right? You couple that with the ability to scale linearly. Now you'll be able to, we basically future-proofed our systems to, even as you add more nodes, you're adding more processing power, memory, and throughput along with that storage capacity, right? And because we're doing it, around storage capacity and not processing power, this is at a lowest possible cost. Because we don't end of life our systems, your investment protection is there, because what you buy, you don't have to churn every 18 to 36 months. You can just continue to add to it. And for me to do replication, I don't need a like for like system. Again, just really the landing zones what sets us apart, guys. And the ability to scale linearly. As I add more nodes in the grid, I'm able to add more processing power, memory, and throughput along with storage capacity as I grow. And because we don't have to have like-for-like systems for replication, right? This is at the lowest possible cost. So my cost to actually do DR is feasible, right? People say, look, I couldn't do DR before, but now I can because the cost is there. And our world-class support, again, having that tier 2 support engineer for your backup application as your first call person, customers really love that. Out of the 400 customer success stories that we have, over half of them talk about that world-class support that we have.
So what's an ideal target customer from a data size perspective?
It really depends. What we like to say is we're 50 terabytes and above, right? But quite frankly, it's really anybody that has more than 4 weeks of retention, because the retention is really what kind of guides us in how long we keep the data for, is how big we size you for, right? Because if you're just going to keep your data for 2 weeks, straight disk is probably the easiest thing to do. Or it's probably the more feasible thing to do. But if you're going to keep it for more than 4 weeks, straight disk is going to be a lot more expensive after 4 weeks, regardless of what the size is.
Now, is the storage allocation between your tiered zones, is that configurable, or is it 50-50, or you guys have some ratio there? How does that work?
Yeah, it starts off 50-50, but we have the ability to move that, move the line up and down. So I can have more landing zone or more repository depending on what the requirement is from the customer. We do have customers that say they want to keep a year's worth of data in the repository. So I'll have a 25 terabyte landing zone for their data, but then I'll have 150 terabytes of repository for their retention. So it is
Gotcha.
able to we are able to move it back and forth.
And as you add modules, because this is highly scalable, right? Because you're just adding a box essentially.
Yes, sir.
From a hyperconverged standpoint. Does that ratio then push down to the rest of the boxes, or is it because it's just looked at as one big resource pool?
It's yes. It just I hate to use the term, but just think of it as one big global namespace, right? So as I add more boxes, you'll see your landing zone grow, and you'll see your repository grow.
Gotcha. Nice. I guess while we wait, I was thinking about the poll questions in the beginning. Are there what kind of reports are there reports that you can leverage for the management console?
Yes, there is. There's basically reports on everything. You can report on the shares. You can report on the power. You can report on backups, on the ingestion. So there's a lot of there's a whole slew of reports that you can actually pull from the Exagrid.
Gotcha. So retention and what about auditing from a compliance
There's
standpoint?
nothing in there for auditing yet, but that's I think mostly we use auditing through the backup application, right? Because a lot of the backup apps have auditing purpose stuff built into it, and we're just really dumb disks, right? We just know how to separate the landing zone from the repository and take care of it that way.
I do have a couple questions. How large does your system scale to?
2.7 petabytes at 488 terabytes an hour.
Okay, and another one, what backup apps do you?
Pretty much every backup app that's out there. I think there's 27 backup apps that we support. The only ones that we don't are the ones that are all inclusive, like Avamar, Rubrik, Cohesity. Those are like the only three that we don't work with.
One second question. How do I shorten my backup window?
Just back up to us. So the beauty of the Exagrid is that we guarantee a 4 to 6 hour backup window, depending on regardless of what size it is. So we'll size you to the point where we can actually shorten your backup window to 4 to 6 hours. And because of the landing zone, and we have that backup window 4 to 6 hours, your restore time for everything is going to be 4 to 6 hours. So and we guarantee that in writing.
How is the storage represented to the backup applications?
It'll either be a CIF share, an NFS share, or what we call a Veeam data mover share. So Veeam has a specific share that they use with us that doesn't use CIFs or NFS. It's like a Veeam to Veeam connection that we do with the server.
Gotcha. So that's interesting. So you can, if you do have a scenario where you have multiple backup platforms, because maybe there was some acquisitions or you have different technologies, chances are that you can partition out and actually support multiple platforms within that same backup infrastructure.
Yeah, 100%. So we have customers that have, that in the old days, they were using Commvault for their physical machines. They were using Veeam for their virtual machines, and then they still had Oracle RMAN and SQL backups. So we were able just to create shares based on the actual backup itself and have all 4 of those backups going to the Exagrid at once.
Gotcha. And your support for SQL, I saw that. And is that where SQL is running backup jobs and you're just presenting a CIF share to it?
Yes, sir. 100%. And
Gotcha.
then with Oracle, it'd be an NFS share.
Very good. Well, thank you, Kristen. And thank you, John and Abhi, and everyone else for joining us.
No problem. Thank you.
On behalf of Exagrid and the Forthright teams, I'd like to thank you for your time today. If you have any questions about the webinar that weren't answered, you can just send them to the marketing Forthright email, and I can get them to the correct person. Okay. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us.